Britain's Scotland Yard on the defensive after the detention and questioning of David Miranda under so-called anti-terror laws. Miranda is the partner of the Guardian journalist who's been reporting on the NSA surveillance program. So was his detention related to national security, or was it to intimidate journalists? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Shihab Ratansi. Britain's Guardian newspaper has revealed the government forced it to destroy files collected by US whistleblower Edward Snowden. Alan Rusbridger, the newspaper's editor, says he was contacted by a senior British government official who said he was representing the views of the Prime Minister. Senior officials then oversaw the destruction of documents. Rusbridger says the government threatened legal action if the paper refused to comply. The British government is already under pressure to explain why it detained the partner of journalist Glenn Greenwald, the man who broke the NSA surveillance stories. David Miranda was detained under the Terrorism Act as he transited through London. He was questioned for the full 9 hours allowed by law in what he says was a total abuse of power. To discuss this, I'm joined by three guests. They're all in London. Glenmore Trenier-Harvey, Editor-in-Chief of the World Intelligence Review. Isabella Sankey, Policy Director for Liberty. Isabella is a human rights specialist. And Padraig Reidy, News Editor at Index on Censorship. So let's begin with the latest information we've got from the editor of The Guardian. According to him, over the course of a few months, security officials, government officials told him, quote, "You've had your fun, now we want the stuff back," and, quote, "You've had your debate, there's no need to write anymore," quote. Rusbridger did note that the destruction of any hard drives wasn't going to make any difference since the information was stored elsewhere as well. So he added, quote, "Whitehall was satisfied, but it felt like a particularly pointless piece of symbolism that understood nothing about the digital age," end quote. Glenmore Trenier-Harvey, then help us make sense of this as a security expert. I suppose, first of all, are you comfortable with the picture of security officials overseeing the destruction of information in the basement of a newspaper in London in 2013? But secondly, are we really to believe that the security officials thought, well, this was going to be the end of it?
Well, to conflate those two questions, Alan Rusbridger is absolutely right. You know, the thought that you can bash a hard drive to smithereens and then destroy the information, okay, but that information is in the ether, it's out there, and that Rusbridger said, okay, we will continue. We won't necessarily do it in the United Kingdom, but it's in the cloud. You know, it's away. That's the first point. So there's huge naivety on the British Security and Intelligence Service. In point of fact, it's the Metropolitan Police in this particular instance, aided by a couple of GCHQ officials. So the thought that you could kill the information is absolutely wrong. But there's also naivety too on the behalf of Rusbridger and indeed Miranda and Greenwald as well.
In what sense?
Well, the very thought that they are dealing with surveillance by the National Security Agency and by GCHQ, given that Edward Snowden has blown the gaff on the extraordinary things, PRISM, Tempora, all of the different programs, and the one we heard last week, the definitely illegal one where NSA are surveilling American citizens without the permission of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Nowadays, we have to operate knowing that anything we do digitally is open to surveillance.
Yeah, but I'm confused because you said Rusbridger was naive. I mean, I still don't quite follow that. I mean, he does have a right to report on these issues, though, doesn't he?
He has a right to talk about the surveillance himself. Whether he has a right to publish stolen information that could indeed jeopardize the position of intelligence officers, let's say dealing with Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula or things like that. No, he doesn't. I mean, the whole thing about Miranda, he was a courier. He was on his way from Berlin to Rio de Janeiro. carrying stolen goods.
All right.
What difference is that between someone carrying cocaine?
I'll stop you there because we're going to get into Miranda a little later. But Padraig Reedy, as far as what Rusbridger has described, do you think this was naivete on the part of the Metropolitan Police and GCHQ, or were they actually trying to send a message?
It's you say we'll talk about Miranda later, but when we hear about these visits from GCHQ operatives and the smashing up things and a MacBook in the basement, coupled with the almost 9-hour detention of David Miranda on Sunday, it's hard not to think that the security forces perhaps realise themselves that they know there's not much they can do about the information itself, but that they are attempting to send a message that this is unacceptable. As they said to John Rusbridger, "You've had your fun, now give us the stuff back." I don't think that the Guardian's been particularly naive about things being in the cloud and things and being open to surveillance, which is exactly why they have been flying journalists all around the world at enormous expense to conduct face-to-face meetings and face-to-face handovers of materials, rather than just simply emailing or Dropboxing or many of the other countless methods which would be very easily trapped by the security services. It is, I must repeat, very worrying that the government seems very willing to engage in what Alan Rusbridger described as an attempt, at least, at prior restraint against journalism, which so far we have seen has been in the public interest, regardless of one's personal opinions on Greenwald or on Snowden or their relationship with Snowden ending up in Moscow or any of these things. There's no doubt that it is in the public interest to know what the government can read, what the government can watch that we're doing.
Isabella Sankey, perhaps you can explain that term, prior restraint. And as far as we know, Rusbridger wasn't forced to destroy those hard drives because authorities already had some kind of legal authority, but it was at the threat of some future legal authority. Is that correct?
That's our understanding. It's not entirely clear, but from what Mr. Rusbridger has written this morning, it seems as if a huge amount of intimidation was applied with the implied, the implication that if they didn't destroy this material, there would be much tougher injunctions and sanctions to come.
So prior restraint means censoring information before it's published. Is it difficult to get that sort of authority from the courts? Does the public interest come into it? What sort of process might the authorities have used in order to get that sort of authority?
They would have needed to go to court and seek an injunction and try and argue that this would be damaging to be put into the public domain. Unfortunately, we do have quite generous laws allowing for injunctions, and sometimes not even those injunctions to be known about, in the form of a super injunction. Here in the UK, we don't have the same robust protections as they do in America, which is another thing that Mr. Rusbridger has observed. It's very chilling indeed to hear of the type of pressure and intimidation and downright arrogance of a security establishment that seems increasingly out of control. You know, the idea you've had your debate that the story's gone away. Well, as we've seen from the public backlash here in the UK, but also globally, diplomatic crisis has been caused by the revelations of Mr. Edward Snowden. The idea that this is now going to go away and people are going to forget about the fact that our intelligence agency seems to have expanded their capabilities beyond anyone's previous wild fantasies is certainly naive of them, but also incredibly arrogant.
Right, so this does kind of bring us then on to Miranda finally, because it is these digital fingerprints, as Rusbridger himself has mentioned, that is making journalism so vulnerable right now. And as Padraig was saying, that's one of the reasons why everyone's flying around the world in order to get Edward Snowden's revelations out there. So David Miranda, who had actually been meeting with one of the other journalists who's working on the Snowden story, stopped while in transit at Heathrow Airport. He's held there under Schedule 7 of Britain's Terrorism Act, and according to the code of practice that police officers use, Schedule 7 can only be used for the purpose of determining if someone is involved in the, quote, commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism. Under the law, suspects have no right to remain silent, no right to legal representation, and can have their property confiscated. Interestingly, the government has proposed a number of changes to Schedule 7 because of what it says are, quote, concerns that it can operate unfairly. Between 2011 and last year, British police made nearly 70,000 stops. They resulted, though, in just 24 terrorism-related arrests. David Anderson, who's the UK's anti-terrorism watchdog, has noted that the law has, quote, given rise to resentment, particularly in the Muslim community. And what's interesting, though, is given this, it's quite specific, Schedule 7, about why you can be stopped. Miranda himself says terrorism didn't even come up when he was interviewed.
Not one question was about terrorism, not one. They asked what my role was in the NSA document story. I explained I don't have any direct involvement with these documents. I do not work with them.
Then, Motrinier Harvey, surely, isn't that a bit odd? I mean, isn't it reasonable to expect, if you're specifically being held under statutes designed to combat terrorism, isn't it reasonable to expect some questions about terrorism and not about journalism?
Well, the whole point is that in that questioning, you don't necessarily, when you're interrogating someone, flag up the questions, what they're related to. And the whole point in going through his digital equipment, going through his thumb drive, going through his PDF, everything, was indeed to discover what was on there. I'm all in favour. I think that the Guardian have done a good thing, as have the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, in highlighting the fact that it seems to me that the surveillance agencies, NSA, GCHQ, have been riding roughshod over the legal process. To highlight that is a good thing. Right. What I don't think is right is the actual information contained within those stolen documents.
And that could potentially constitute terrorism?
Well, absolutely. As I say, that, you know, if that information related to ongoing investigations by intelligence officers in this country, in Pakistan, in Mali, wherever, then that jeopardizes the activity of the intelligence officers and the agents they have recruited. And that very definitely could have an impact on British security.
And we do now have a statement from the British government. A Home Office spokesman has said, quote, the government and the police have a duty to protect the public and our national security. If the police believe that an individual is in possession of highly sensitive stolen information that would help terrorism, then they should act, and the law provides them with a framework to do that. Those who oppose this sort of action need to think about what they are condoning. Padraig, is that satisfactory?
There's a real subtext there if you're either with us or against us. The revelations so far that have come from the Snowden documents have been about the mechanics of surveillance, really, not about specific information gleaned from surveillance. Indeed, the Guardian has been pretty much praised for its restraint, perhaps, in putting forward these things and not actually being, just putting out information that's useful for terrorists. But there are two problems here. One is we have to find what can be useful for terrorists. All sorts of information can be useful for terrorists. Maps can be useful for terrorists, for example. But there is also the harder question of if, as we seem to have been told, the authorities knew who David Miranda was, what he was doing. Apparently the US government was tipped off on this and told that there was an intention to stop him. Downing Street was told that there was an intention to stop Mr. Miranda at Heathrow Airport. Then obviously they knew what he was doing there. And there are all sorts of laws which have their own problems concerning demanding journalistic materials. So unless they genuinely believed, which I don't think anyone does, that Mr. Miranda or Mr. Greenwald or indeed Mr. Rusbridger are engaged in or supporting terrorist activities, then there are very serious questions over why they use this particular power in Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act in order to stop Mr. Miranda.
Is there actually Isabella, any sense that we can find out why? Is there any transparency to find out how they came to the decision that Schedule 7 should be invoked in the case of Miranda? Will we find out, or is it just a matter of trust us? We know what could potentially threaten national security.
The problem here is that the Schedule 7 power is incredibly broad. Yes, it makes reference to the purpose being the purpose for using it needing to be related to instigation, etc., of terrorism, but it can be used when there is absolutely no suspicion, no reasonable suspicion of somebody's involvement, and that's why we've seen so many routine abuses of this power over the years, as you say, particularly in relation to the Muslim community, who are almost routinely stopped coming and going from the country. So it's an incredibly broad power which allows very intrusive questioning, examination and searching, as you say, confiscation of property, and you can have your fingerprints taken, mouth swabs taken, etc., without access to a lawyer. What the authorities appear to do with this power is take advantage of its very broad scope. Quite separately, the statute book is also littered with powers for the police, if they have suspicion of somebody's involvement in terrorism, to make an arrest. And it's important to bear that distinction in mind. They didn't choose to use those other powers available to them in relation to any Guardian journalists, in relation to anyone else involved in the Snowden revelations here in the UK, possibly because of the very clear problems that would present in PR terms, targeting journalists in that way. But they've used this loophole, it appears, that when somebody is travelling, this very broad power is available on the statute book that can be exercised without any need for suspicion. We've long had concerns about Schedule 7, and it's a power we're actually currently challenging in the European Court of Human Rights.
But just to get a little bit more information on how this works before I bring Glenmore back in, given that Schedule 7 gives the police powers of search and seizure without probable cause, is there any kind of oversight over this, given also that the statistics seem quite startling? 70,000 people stopped, but only 24 people arrested as a result of those stops. It kind of reminds you of the New York stop and frisk policy that's recently been ruled unconstitutional by a judge in the US. I mean, is there any oversight to see, well, hang on, is this actually, does this look proportionate?
The only real oversight is the role of the government's terrorism review, who produces reports and their publication of statistics. But our view is that the power as currently drafted is so broad that it's actually unlawful and that it doesn't comply with the Convention on Human Rights. There was a similar power on the statute book in the UK until quite recently, which allowed for stop and search without suspicion, a bit like the New York stop and frisk policy, in whole areas of the UK, and that could be authorised for months and months on end, and that again saw a huge amount of discrimination on our streets and routine hassling of minority ethnic members of our community, and that was ruled unlawful by the Court of Human Rights and has since been repealed. So the hope is that the court will take a similarly dim view of Schedule 7, because there is currently no effective oversight or checks and balances on its use.
All right, so let's bring Glenmore back in then. As far as Miranda is concerned, we are expected to trust, or at least, you know, as far as anyone is concerned, we're expected to trust that the security services have our best interests at heart. Are we, I mean, really, you're satisfied with that? You're comfortable with that? You're comfortable giving that trust to the security services in their policy to employ Schedule 7?
I am indeed, but before I elaborate on that, I'd like to just respond to something that Podrick said in his contribution earlier, in that the Guardian had published only the methodology employed by the security and intelligence services, nothing in the content that would assist a terrorist. Well, I want to give you one specific example. Following 9/11, Osama bin Laden was communicating with other members of Al-Qaeda at that time using satellite telephones. They subsequently went on to one-time use pay-as-you-go. And this briefing had been given to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and there's one senator, Senator Orrin Hatch, came out and said, "Don't you worry, we were going to get these guys because we can track their satellite phones." He didn't say specifically Osama bin Laden, but he talked about the methodology. Within 6 weeks, the Al-Qaeda network had closed down their use of satellite telephones and started to move in other directions.
But that wasn't a journalist, though, was it?
Example.
That was a particular right-wing senator. So far, certainly with the revelations, though, they've been going through quite rather strict proofing and filtering to ensure that
Yes,
they don't give away national security secrets, haven't they? The Guardian and other.
I was using that as an example.
Okay.
I was using that as an example of when information is given out in all innocence, talking about methodology, whether it's by a senator or reported by a journalist.
Right.
The impact can be beneficial to terrorists.
But I think one of the reasons why all this information is coming out so slowly is because they are going through all this information. I mean, for example, then, Glenn Moore, if a journalist was writing about a military whistleblower who said that armoured jeeps, as they currently are constructed, can't stand roadside bombs, while helping to save military lives, would that also be alerting Al-Qaeda that they can actually attack these jeeps? Would that then be threatening national security and akin to some sort of form of terrorism or helping terrorism?
Well, obviously, these things are not 100% black or white. On the one hand, of course, it would be supporting our troops. And as a Vice President of the United Kingdom National Defence Association, I applaud that. But at the same time, I recognise that that information would assist Al-Qaeda in the production of IEDs, because they would say, we can go after those.
So we're back to where we draw the line then between journalism and the public interest and aiding terrorism. I'm just trying to find out how you do draw that line, since you seem quite convinced that currently Greenwald and his associates are on the wrong side of that line.
Yes, well, it goes back to what you said beforehand. The security forces, the security service, MI5, their motto is a defense of the realm. They are our first line between us and terrorism affecting our country. And, you know, individual freedoms, vitally important, but I would forego my individual freedom provided that my family and my colleagues are protected by that information being obtained.
Isabel Sankey, I guess we're back to oversight again, though. I mean, can we give that trust to the security forces? Have they earned that trust, would you feel, without having some quite clear oversight?
I think there's a huge problem with trust at the moment, and you know, going back to Prism, Tempora. Before that, we had scandals of extraordinary rendition, things that are done in freedom's name, but that are completely anathema to you know, the values that we've traditionally sought to uphold in this society. And that's really when a society turns in on itself. And I think, you know, measures such as this, blanket surveillance of a population, blanket powers like Schedule 7, which allow for hugely intrusive power to be exercised against the individual without suspicion. These are not powers that should happily coexist in a free society, and they need to be urgently looked at by our parliamentarians. Of course, security and safety are incredibly important. Of course, that's what the security services are charged with upholding, but they need to respect basic principles of legality, of the rule of law, of necessity and proportionality in so doing. Otherwise, you know, the values that they're trying to defend, they are actually undermining themselves.
Padraig, I mean, is there any clear-cut definition of what terrorism means in this context, or is it perhaps a bit like Egypt, just whatever the government doesn't happen to be terribly fond of at the particular moment?
Well, no, we'll never. I mean, terrorism is, you know, it is, you know, politically motivated violence by non-state actors. It is not. It is certainly not, you know, public interest journalism, which is what the Guardian has been involved in. But going back to the point again about materials that would aid journalists, I mean, as I said earlier, all sorts of materials, and as you mentioned, could aid journalists. You know, information about weaponry, ordnance survey maps. You know, it's all about the context, and it's all about the balance and reaching a balance between security, privacy, free speech, and a free press. And at the moment, I would agree with Isabella that we've gone too far one way. I think that it's somehow a consequence as well of the enormous technological advances we've had in the past 20, 25 years. While they on one hand give us fantastic freedom to communicate, they also allow us incredible powers of surveillance. And there seems to be a feeling among the security community at large, so to speak, that because you can do these things, because it is possible to carry out blanket surveillance, then there is no reason not to. And I think we all need to step back and think of why these acts are carried out and what the purpose of these acts are carried out and how much we are willing to give away our privacy in the name of security, and vice versa.
Thank you to my guests, Dunmore Harvey, Isabella Sankey and Podrick Reedy. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Shihab Rutansi. Thanks for watching.